The coffee splashed across Ayana's silk blouse, its heat stinging her skin as the liquid quickly soaked through the fabric. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, but it was the stewardess's reaction that cut deeper than the burn. Instead of an apology, the woman gave Ayana a dismissive look and muttered under her breath, "You people always make a big deal out of nothing." Ayana didn't flinch. Years of enduring subtle, and not so subtle, prejudices had taught her the power of silence. She calmly reached for a napkin from the tray in front of her, dabbing at the mess as whispers buzzed among the other passengers. Some watched with morbid curiosity, others with quiet disapproval. A man in the row behind her murmured something about standards dropping everywhere these days, and Ayana couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on her skin before he turned back to his phone. She glanced up at the stewardess, Pamela, whose name tag gleamed under the harsh cabin lights. Pamela didn't meet her gaze but instead turned sharply on her heel, muttering as she walked away, "Some people just don't belong in first class." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were so painfully familiar. Ayana shifted in her seat, smoothing her blouse, and glanced around. Across the aisle, an older black woman gave her a small, knowing nod, a quiet gesture of solidarity. Ayana offered a faint smile in return, though her thoughts churned beneath the surface. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered bias in unexpected places. It wasn't even the first time that day. But this time was different. This wasn't just any airline. This was her airline. As the flight settled into its routine, Ayana's mind replayed the incident. She had chosen to fly incognito for a reason. Stewardess Airlines was her pride and joy, a company she had built from the ground up to redefine the aviation experience. She wanted to create a space where passengers of all backgrounds felt valued and respected, a space where incidents like this weren't supposed to happen. But today had proven how far there still was to go. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing slight turbulence ahead. Ayana leaned back in her seat, watching Pamela make her way down the aisle. The stewardess smiled warmly at some passengers, offering extra snacks or drinks, but her demeanor shifted noticeably as she approached others, particularly those who, like Ayana, didn't quite fit her idea of who should occupy these seats. Ayana folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm but her mind racing. There was no need for confrontation now. Not yet. She had learned over the years that timing was everything, that battles won in the heat of the moment often came at the cost of the larger war. No, she would wait. As the turbulence grew stronger, Pamela's confident facade began to crack. A sudden jolt sent her stumbling into a passenger's tray, scattering drinks and silverware. Ayana instinctively unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, steadying Pamela and helping her regain her balance. For a brief moment, Pamela looked at her with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," she mumbled, her voice softer now, her arrogance momentarily replaced by vulnerability. Ayana nodded silently and returned to her seat. She didn't miss the way Pamela's gaze lingered, as though for the first time, she was seeing Ayana as something more than just another inconvenience. The turbulence passed, and the cabin settled once more, but the atmosphere remained charged. Ayana could feel the eyes of the older woman across the aisle, the whispered comments from passengers behind her, and most of all, the weight of Pamela's discomfort. She let out a slow breath, her decision made. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about her. It was about the values she had built her company on, and the responsibility she had to uphold them. This was far from over. Ayana had always known that success in a system rigged against you didn't come without sacrifice. Growing up, she had been the only black girl in her class, the only one who had been told her dreams were too big for someone like her. But those words, meant to discourage her, had instead fueled her. From a young age, Ayana learned to be self-reliant. Her mother, a fierce woman who had raised Ayana on her own, taught her that in order to succeed, she would have to be twice as good, work twice as hard, and prove herself in every space she entered. The world might not give her the benefit of the doubt, but Ayana wasn't interested in their approval. She wanted something more, power, not to dominate, but to change things. Her journey into aviation had been an uphill battle. Ayana had started in the industry as a junior analyst for a regional airline, far from the glamorous world of the big players. She faced constant doubt, dismissive glances, and backhanded compliments that made her question whether the obstacles were too great. But giving up was never an option. Ayana rose through the ranks, each step a testament to her work ethic, her sharp mind, and her refusal to let anyone define her capabilities. When the opportunity came to purchase Stewardess Airlines, Ayana seized it. The company had potential, but it was mired in outdated practices and a lack of diversity at the top. The previous owners hadn't understood the value of a diverse workforce or the importance of fostering an inclusive culture. Ayana saw it as her mission to change that. Building the company from the ground up took years, a never-ending grind of meetings, negotiations, and navigating the often hostile waters of corporate America. There were moments when she doubted herself, when it seemed like the weight of the industry would crush her dreams. But those were fleeting. She had learned that resilience wasn't about never feeling weak. It was about pushing forward even when the world made it clear it expected you to fall. Stewardess became a symbol, a beacon for what was possible when someone with the right vision took the reins. Ayana didn't just want to create a successful airline. She wanted to create a company where people of all races, backgrounds, and walks of life felt they belong. She wanted Stewardess to be a place where equality wasn't a slogan, it was a practice, woven into every interaction, every policy, every flight. Yet, even now, sitting on this plane, the sting of what had happened earlier in the day gnawed at her. Pamela's words, the casual cruelty she'd faced from someone who was supposed to represent the airline's values, weren't an isolated incident. Ayana had seen it before, small acts of prejudice that, when left unchecked, grew into something far more damaging. She had made the decision to observe her airline from the perspective of a passenger, to see how her employees behaved when they weren't aware of her identity. What she had seen today had shaken her. While most of her staff had shown kindness and professionalism, it was clear that biases, both conscious and unconscious, still had a foothold. This wasn't just about Pamela's behavior. It was about a culture that had ingrained these ideas, a culture that needed to be reformed from the inside out. But Ayana wasn't about to let this setback define her. She had worked too hard, overcome too much, to let one stewardess's ignorance overshadow the values she had spent years instilling in her company. Pamela's actions were a symptom of a much larger issue, and Ayana knew that addressing it head-on was the only way forward. She thought back to her early days in the business, to the countless conversations she had had with mentors who had warned her of the dangers of letting her guard down. But this wasn't just about protecting herself, it was about protecting the legacy she was building. She had made it this far not by playing by the rules, but by rewriting them. Stewardess had grown because it embraced diversity and inclusion at its core, not as a corporate slogan, but as the foundation of its operations. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She would face resistance, not just from outsiders, but from within her own ranks. Change was never welcomed by those who had benefited from the status quo. Ayana understood that. But she was ready for it. The turbulence of the day was just the beginning. Pamela's careless words and actions had ignited something in Ayana. It was no longer just about the airline. It was about a larger fight for equity, for respect, for dignity. She would make sure that Stewardess not only lived up to its values but became a model for others to follow. Tomorrow, there would be consequences. Pamela wouldn't get off easy, but Ayana wasn't interested in punishment. What she wanted was accountability. She would ensure that Pamela, and anyone else who thought they could disrespect a passenger without consequence, understood what it meant to truly embody the values of Stewardess Airlines. But more than that, Ayana realized this was an opportunity. A crisis, yes, but one that could be turned into a pivotal moment for the company. If she handled it right, she could turn the incident into a teaching moment, not just for Pamela, but for the entire company. There were systemic changes that needed to be made. Stewardess could not afford to be complacent. It was time for a cultural shift, one that would ensure every employee and passenger knew that this was a space where discrimination was not tolerated. Ayana leaned back in her seat, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. There would be hard conversations ahead, difficult decisions to be made, but she was ready. She had always been ready for this moment. Ayana's resolve was solidified by the quiet hum of the plane as it cruised through the sky. She wasn't one to make hasty decisions, especially in the heat of a moment. But today was different. She knew that what had transpired was more than just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of deeper issues within her company, and it required a response that went beyond just reprimanding Pamela. The plane landed without further incident, and as she stepped into the terminal, Ayana made a mental note of every employee she passed. She didn't need to ask if they knew who she was. Ayana had a reputation that preceded her, but today, she wasn't a CEO or an icon of success. She was a woman who had witnessed something unacceptable, and she was about to make it clear that it wouldn't be tolerated in any form. At the airport, Ayana made her way directly to the head office. She didn't stop to chat with colleagues or engage in pleasantries. Her thoughts were focused on the action she needed to take. The moment she walked into her office, she sat behind her desk and began drafting an email that would be sent to every employee, from the top to the bottom of the company's ladder. The email would be straightforward. It wasn't the time for sugarcoating. She started with the facts, what had happened, the behavior she had witnessed, and the stark reality that her company, despite its mission, had fallen short of its values. She would not allow any room for ambiguity. The goal was clear: this would not stand. There would be no tolerance for prejudice, no space for discriminatory actions under her leadership. But Ayana knew this had to go beyond an email. She couldn't just let the message sit in inboxes without further action. She picked up the phone and dialed the head of human resources, Jennifer, a longtime ally who understood her vision for the company. "I need to have a meeting tomorrow morning." "First thing," Ayana said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to discuss this incident and how we are going to handle it." Jennifer responded immediately, her tone indicating she already understood the gravity of the situation. "I'll make the arrangements. We'll gather the necessary information and ensure this is addressed thoroughly." The conversation ended quickly, and Ayana sat back in her chair, her mind still racing. She couldn't afford to let this go unnoticed. Pamela's actions were just the tip of the iceberg. There were likely more incidents that had gone unreported, more subtle acts of bias that had slipped under the radar because people had learned to turn a blind eye. Ayana knew she had to lead with purpose. Her thoughts then turned to the staff training she had introduced when she first took over the company. Diversity and inclusion had been at the forefront of Stewardess's operations from the very beginning. But it was clear now that those values hadn't been fully embraced by every employee. Some had learned to parrot the right words, but hadn't internalized the necessary mindset. This was about changing hearts and minds, not just checking off boxes. The next morning, the meeting was held as scheduled. Jennifer, along with other senior leaders from HR and operations, sat around the table. Ayana stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding yet calm. She recapped the incident, focusing on the severity of the problem but framing it as a catalyst for much-needed change. "We've done well in many areas, but clearly, we've missed the mark in others," Ayana began, her voice steady. "The behavior we witnessed yesterday is a reflection of a deeper issue that we've allowed to persist. It is my responsibility to ensure that Stewardess isn't just a company that talks about diversity, it is one that lives it, every day, in every interaction." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "We've made progress in training and recruitment, but this is an indication that we've failed to reach certain parts of the workforce. We can't just sweep this under the rug. There needs to be accountability." The room fell silent for a moment. Ayana's eyes scanned the faces around the table. She wasn't seeking agreement, she was seeking action. "This is what we're going to do," Ayana continued. "First, we're going to address Pamela directly. She will undergo a comprehensive retraining, and we'll have a discussion about her behavior. This isn't just about discipline, it's about understanding why her actions were harmful and how we can ensure they're not repeated." There was a murmur of agreement. Ayana paused, then added, "But we're not stopping there. We're going to implement company-wide training, mandatory for all employees, that addresses unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of empathy in the workplace. This will be a continuous process, not just a one-time seminar. We need to embed this into our culture. The group nodded again, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Ayana wasn't done. We will also be rolling out a feedback system, so employees can anonymously report any incidents of discrimination or bias they encounter. No one should feel like they're at risk of retaliation for speaking up. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. And I want us to reevaluate our hiring practices. Diversity isn't just about quotas, it's about making sure our teams reflect the world we serve. Jennifer quickly took notes, her pen moving furiously. We'll get started on the retraining program immediately. I'll coordinate with the training department to revise the curriculum. Ayana nodded. Good. And I want regular reports on progress. We'll review everything in 3 months, but I want to see measurable improvements before then. The meeting wrapped up, and Ayana sat back in her office, the weight of the decisions she had just made beginning to sink in. There was no turning back. The changes she was implementing would not be easy, and they would face resistance from some quarters. But this was bigger than any single person or policy. It was about creating a company that wasn't just a reflection of her ideals, but one that actively worked to challenge the injustices that had been allowed to fester for too long. Ayana understood that the road ahead would be challenging, but she also knew that this was the right thing to do. She wasn't just fighting for the future of Skirich, she was fighting for the future of the industry itself. The world was changing, and Ayana was determined to ensure that Skirich would be at the forefront of that transformation. The following days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and decisions. Ayana's resolve to reshape Skirich's corporate culture had set a fire in the company, and she wasn't about to let it burn out. She had quickly implemented the new training modules, ensuring that every employee, from the flight attendants to the executives, understood that the incident with Pamela was just the beginning of a larger reckoning. This was about accountability, personal growth, and a commitment to creating a truly inclusive environment. Pamela, in particular, was at the center of it all. Ayana had personally sat down with her to discuss what had happened and why it had hurt not just the passenger, but the reputation of Skirich itself. Pamela, to her credit, hadn't been defensive. She had listened as Ayana explained the impact of her actions and the company's commitment to fostering an environment of respect and dignity. There were no excuses, no room for minimizing the damage done. Pamela's behavior was unacceptable, but Ayana wasn't interested in simply punishing her. She wanted to see growth, an opportunity for the stewardess to better understand the broader implications of her actions. As Ayana had anticipated, Pamela's response was a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. However, as the conversation progressed, Ayana saw a shift. The stewardess began to see the depth of the mistake, and for the first time, she acknowledged her role in perpetuating an atmosphere of prejudice, however unconsciously. This wasn't about a single incident, it was about creating lasting change within an organization that had, for too long, let small acts of bias slide by unnoticed. Pamela had agreed to go through the retraining sessions, and Ayana had made it clear that her future at Skirich depended on her willingness to change. But that was only part of the solution. The company-wide training sessions Ayana had scheduled were intense. They weren't a mere formality. They were designed to provoke deep reflection and open, honest discussions about race, privilege, and discrimination. As the days passed, Ayana watched as employees who had once dismissed the importance of such training began to engage. There were the inevitable awkward moments, the uncomfortable silences, but there was also a tangible shift in the way people interacted. Ayana's leadership wasn't about forcing compliance. It was about inspiring people to genuinely care, to challenge their own preconceived notions, and to embrace the idea that everyone, regardless of background, deserved respect and opportunity. But even with these efforts, Ayana knew that a change in culture couldn't happen overnight. She understood that the process of dismantling years of ingrained biases and inequalities would take time, patience, and consistent effort. That meant it couldn't just be about policies and training, it had to be about leadership. Her leadership. She needed to lead by example, to hold herself and those around her accountable for creating an environment where prejudice couldn't thrive. One evening, After a long day of meetings, Ayana found herself alone in her office. The steady hum of the city outside her window felt distant, almost foreign. The weight of her decisions, the responsibility of her role, pressed heavily on her. The work ahead was monumental, and Ayana couldn't help but feel the gravity of what she was attempting to accomplish. But this was no time for doubt. Ayana knew that Skirich's success wasn't just about financial growth. It was about building something that would leave a legacy. A legacy not just of profit, but of transformation. She didn't want to look back years from now and see the same complacency, the same subtle biases, perpetuating themselves within her company. She had to ensure that Skirich wasn't just a part of the status quo. It had to be a company that actively fought to redefine the status quo. The following week, Ayana held a town hall with the entire company. It wasn't a typical corporate gathering where executives spoke down from a stage. This was an open conversation, a chance for employees to voice their thoughts, ask questions, and challenge the direction the company was taking. Ayana made it clear from the outset that this would not be a one-sided conversation. She wanted feedback. She wanted to hear about the concerns, the fears, and even the resistance that some employees were likely feeling. The room was filled with tension. Ayana could feel the weight of the silence as people filtered in. She understood that many weren't fully on board with the changes she was advocating for. There was always resistance to change, especially when it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. But Ayana was unflinching. She stood before the crowd and addressed them with a calm but firm tone. "I want to make one thing clear," she began. "What happened with Pamela was not just an isolated mistake. It was a reflection of something much larger. A problem that exists within our industry and, unfortunately, within our own company. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge. And I'm here to tell you that Skirich will not tolerate discrimination in any form." There were murmurs in the room, some agreeing, others clearly uneasy. Ayana continued, "This isn't about singling anyone out. This is about all of us, myself included, recognizing where we've failed and committing to do better. It's about creating a culture of accountability, where we all have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The crowd shifted, some still uncomfortable, others nodding in agreement. Ayana took a deep breath and leaned into the challenge. "I won't sugarcoat it," she said. "This won't be easy. We're going to face challenges. Some of you may not agree with all the changes I'm implementing. But I'm asking for your trust. I'm asking for your commitment to making Skirich not just a successful company, but a company we can all be proud of. A company that values every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background." Ayana's words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of what could be. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she was ready. There was no turning back now. Skirich had the potential to lead by example, to show the world that inclusivity and diversity were not just moral imperatives. They were business imperatives. By the time the town hall ended, Ayana had made her point clear. The company was at a crossroads. They could either resist the changes that were coming or embrace them and help shape the future of aviation. Ayana was no longer just the CEO of Skirich. She was a leader in a movement, one that would challenge every preconceived notion of what a company could be. As the employees filtered out of the room, Ayana stood alone for a moment, the weight of the decision still heavy on her shoulders. But she knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back. Skirich would be better for it, and the world would be watching. The next few weeks felt like a series of calculated steps forward, but each one carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. Skirich's leadership was committed, but the push for change was facing resistance. Ayana had expected some pushback, but seeing it unfold in real time was a reminder of how deeply entrenched the status quo could be. Change, especially systemic change, was never easy. Still, she pressed forward, determined to not only break through the barriers of prejudice but to foster an environment where accountability became as much a part of the company's DNA as the corporate policies themselves. The response to the newly implemented training modules was mixed. Some employees embraced the opportunity for self-reflection and growth, while others quietly resented the disruption to their established routine. Ayana made it clear from the start that there was no room for indifference in her vision for Stewardess. The company wasn't just going to be an organization of high performers. It was going to be an organization where respect for each other's humanity was just as crucial as hitting quarterly targets. It wasn't just about Pamela anymore. She had been a catalyst, but the work Ayana had started was about far more than one stewardess behavior. Stewardess had an opportunity to change the broader culture of the aviation industry, to set an example that other companies would look to and emulate. But Ayana knew that such change was fragile. It required constant vigilance, continual support, and leadership that didn't shy away from hard truths. One afternoon, Ayana received a message that shook her to the core. It was from an employee in the operations department, a longtime member of the team who had worked at Stewardess for years. The email was brief but pointed. "I appreciate your efforts to make this company more inclusive, but I'm afraid it's all a facade. There are those among us who will never accept this change. You may want to reconsider the direction you're taking." Ayana stared at the message for several long moments. There were no accusations, no explicit threats, just a stark reminder of the quiet but persistent resistance she was facing. It wasn't just Pamela. It wasn't even just the senior executives who had quietly questioned her leadership. It was the employees who had worked in the shadows, too afraid to speak openly but now emboldened by the secrecy of their dissent. Ayana wasn't the kind of leader to shrink from criticism. In fact, she welcomed it. But this particular email signified something deeper. It was a signal that the company's culture of accountability was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. People weren't just resisting change, they were actively undermining it, hiding behind their supposed loyalty to the company while rejecting the very principles that would make it better. She decided to confront the issue head-on. Ayana called an emergency meeting with the senior leadership team. When the group assembled, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I received an email today. It's a small thing, but it's a reflection of something much larger. We're facing resistance at all levels, and it's time we address it." There was a tense silence in the room. Ayana's eyes scanned the faces of her team. Some looked uncomfortable, others uncertain. She understood their hesitation. The road ahead was going to require more than just policy changes. It was going to demand an unwavering commitment from everyone involved, no matter their role. "This company is at a crossroads," Ayana continued. "We're not just redefining our culture, we're shifting the way we view accountability, leadership, and inclusivity. And that's not something everyone is going to accept." Jennifer, the head of HR, spoke up, her voice tight but resolute. "We've implemented the training. We're getting pushback in some areas, but we can't let that deter us." Ayana nodded. "I know. And we won't let it. But we need to address this resistance head-on. If people are undermining the work we're doing, we need to know who they are and why they're doing it." There was a long pause. Then, one of the operations managers, Marcus, spoke up, his voice hesitant. "But Ayana, what happens when we start pushing too hard? We could lose people. Some of the older employees, especially, they've been here for years. They're stuck in their ways. I don't know if we can just change them overnight." Ayana's gaze was unwavering as she met his eyes. "This isn't about changing people overnight. It's about showing them why change is necessary. This is the only way forward. If people don't want to be part of that, they don't belong here." The room fell quiet again. The reality was that Ayana wasn't just changing a company, she was challenging a cultural norm that had existed for decades, one that many of her employees had grown comfortable in. She understood that the stakes were high, but her resolve was even higher. Stewardess couldn't afford to waver. The company wasn't just fighting for profits or success, it was fighting for something much more profound. The conversation shifted towards specific action plans. Jennifer suggested setting up smaller, more intimate sessions with employees to gauge their concerns and facilitate open dialogue. It wasn't enough to only push top-down initiatives. Ayana realized that employees at every level needed to feel heard and understood if they were going to buy into the change she was advocating. By the end of the meeting, the leadership team had agreed on a more comprehensive approach. They would continue the training, but they would also introduce a series of one-on-one conversations with key employees, both those who were resistant and those who were embracing the changes. These conversations would give Ayanna and her team a clearer picture of where the company stood, and more importantly, how they could effectively break through the entrenched mindsets that were holding them back. That evening, Ayanna walked the halls of the Skirich headquarters. It was quiet, the office lights dimmed, and the usual bustle of the workday had quieted. She reflected on how far the company had come in such a short time. They had taken bold steps, yes, but the road was still long. There would be more emails like the one she'd received today, more instances of passive resistance, more instances of people trying to hold on to the old ways of doing things. But Ayanna was undeterred. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just about one company. It was about transforming an entire industry, one that had long been defined by a lack of diversity and inclusivity. Skirich had a choice. It could either be part of the problem, or it could be part of the solution. And Ayanna was committed to making sure Skirich would choose the latter. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Ayanna knew she had made the right decision. The journey ahead would not be easy, but the destination was worth every ounce of effort. She was leading a revolution, and there was no turning back now. The following days were filled with momentum and tension in equal measure. Ayanna could feel the pulse of change, but she also saw the pushback intensifying. It wasn't just the resistance from a few employees anymore. It was becoming a more subtle, pervasive undercurrent within the company. Ayanna knew that this was not just a struggle for acceptance. It was a fight for the soul of the organization. She had to maintain her focus, but she had to do it in a way that didn't alienate those who were caught between the old ways and the new vision. A few days after the leadership team meeting, Ayanna received a call from Jennifer. There had been another issue, this time with a member of the operations team. A veteran employee, who had been with Skirich for over a decade, had filed a formal complaint about the new training. He felt that it was divisive and undermining his years of hard work. Ayanna wasn't shocked by the complaint. She had expected this kind of backlash. What concerned her was that this employee, Mike, had been with the company for so long, and his influence was significant. His words carried weight, and if he was speaking out, it meant others were likely feeling the same way. Ayanna's first instinct was to dismiss the complaint. After all, it was just one voice, one person clinging to the past. But as the CEO of Skirich, she knew better than to ignore the concerns of employees, especially those who had been there for so long. Mike's frustration wasn't unique, and his position could be seen as symbolic of the broader challenges the company faced. If she truly wanted to succeed, Ayanna had to address this head-on. The following morning, she called a meeting with Jennifer and Marcus to discuss the situation. She didn't want to approach this without a clear strategy, and her leadership team's input would be essential. "We need to meet with Mike," Ayanna said, her voice firm. "We can't let these small acts of resistance snowball into something bigger. If we don't confront this head-on, we'll lose the trust of the very people we're trying to help." Jennifer nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I agree. But how do we ensure we don't alienate him further? Mike has a lot of respect in the operations department. If we push him too hard, it could backfire." Ayanna took a deep breath. "I don't want to push him. I want to understand where he's coming from. We need to have a real conversation, not a confrontation. I'm not going to force anyone to accept this change, but I need to help them understand why it's necessary." They all agreed that the best course of action would be to meet with Mike one-on-one, in a neutral setting, where they could have an honest and open discussion. Ayanna wasn't naive. She knew the conversation wouldn't be easy. But she also knew it was a necessary part of the process. A few hours later, Ayanna sat across from Mike in a quiet meeting room. The atmosphere was tense, but Ayanna remained calm. She had faced opposition before, but this situation felt different. This was a battle of ideas, of values, and she had to be the one to defend the future of Skirich. "Mike, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," Ayanna began, her tone steady but warm. "I know you have concerns about the new training, and I want to hear you out. Can you tell me what's bothering you?" Mike shifted in his seat, his arms crossed defensively. I just don't understand why we need this. I've been with Skirich for over 10 years. I've always done my job well, and I've always treated people fairly. I don't need someone telling me how to be a decent human being. Iona nodded, acknowledging his frustration. I hear you, Mike. And I don't think the training is about telling you how to be a decent person. It's about making sure everyone, regardless of their background, feels respected and included. It's about building a company where people can thrive, no matter who they are or where they come from. Mike seemed unconvinced, his expression unchanged. But that's not the issue. The issue is the way this whole thing is being pushed down our throats. There's no room for discussion. You're telling us that we have to change, or we're not part of the team. That's not how things should work. Iona leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his. I understand that it feels like the changes are happening too quickly. But sometimes, when we see something that's wrong, we have to act fast. This company has had problems with discrimination in the past, and I want to make sure we never go back to that. It's not about changing who you are, Mike. It's about evolving together as a team, making sure everyone feels valued. There was a long pause. Mike stared at the table, clearly processing her words. Iona didn't push him. She gave him space to think, knowing that forcing him to immediately accept the changes would only build resentment. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice quieter. I get what you're saying. But it's hard. It feels like the world's changing faster than I can keep up with. I've worked hard to get where I am, and now it feels like you're telling me that's not enough. Iona's heart softened. She had seen this resistance before. People who were afraid that their hard work would be overshadowed by the new wave of change. She knew that Mike's fears weren't about the training itself, but about his place in the world. He feared being left behind. I'm not saying that your work isn't enough, Iona said gently. You've earned your place here, and we need people like you to help us guide this change. But it's not just about us as individuals anymore. It's about making sure Skirich is a place where everyone, every single person, can feel like they belong. That's the future I'm building, Mike. And I want you to be a part of it. For a long moment, Mike remained silent. His expression was hard to read. But Iona could see a shift in his demeanor, a small crack in the walls he had built around himself. He wasn't completely convinced, not yet, but she had planted a seed. And that was enough for now. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, Mike said finally, his voice quieter but more open. I'll think about it. Iona stood, extending her hand to him. I'm glad we could have this conversation. And Mike, remember, we're all in this together. Skirich is nothing without its people. As she walked out of the room, Iona felt a sense of resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she had made a breakthrough, and it was a step in the right direction. Change wasn't easy. It wasn't always comfortable. But it was necessary. And Iona was determined to make sure Skirich didn't just survive, it thrived in a new era of equality and inclusivity. The days following her conversation with Mike were a whirlwind. Iona had hoped that the dialogue would be enough to change his mind, but deep down, she knew that one conversation wasn't enough to undo years of resistance and deeply ingrained prejudices. She had planted the seed, but it was up to him, and others like him, to decide whether to water it or let it wither away. But Iona couldn't afford to wait passively for things to unfold. She had a vision for Skirich, and it wasn't going to be realized through isolated conversations or gradual change. It was going to take more, a collective movement, a cultural shift within the company. She needed to be strategic, to rally those who were on board and address the skeptics with consistent clarity and determination. Every decision she made from here on out would either bring her closer to her goal, or derail everything she had worked for. The next challenge came sooner than expected. During a company-wide meeting, Iona announced an initiative that would require all employees to undergo a comprehensive cultural sensitivity and anti-bias training. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some employees expressed their support openly, while others, particularly those who had been with Skirich for a long time, were not so enthusiastic. They viewed it as another mandate from the top, another attempt to force them into compliance with a trend they didn't fully understand. Despite the murmurs of discontent, Ayanna pressed forward. The training wasn't just about teaching employees the basics of cultural awareness. It was a deeper reflection of the company's new direction. It was a commitment to inclusivity, to creating a workplace where every person, regardless of their background, felt valued and respected. Ayanna knew it wouldn't be easy to shift the mindset of those who had spent years in a corporate culture that often turned a blind eye to inequality. But she believed in the power of education and exposure. The training, she hoped, would be the turning point for many. In the days leading up to the training, Ayanna spent more time with Jennifer and Marcus, fine-tuning the logistics. They knew that one of the most significant challenges would be dealing with resistance from the employees who saw this as an unnecessary disruption. It was one thing to ask for voluntary participation. It was another to make it mandatory, especially for a company that prided itself on its entrepreneurial spirit. "We have to be firm, but we also need to show empathy," Ayanna said during one of their strategy sessions. "We can't force people to change, but we can make them understand why it matters. This isn't about guilt or shame, it's about opening their eyes to what's really happening in the world around them." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "But there are some who won't even show up. And what do we do if people just check out mentally during the sessions? We can't force them to internalize the lessons." Ayanna's eyes narrowed with determination. "We make it impossible for them to ignore. We hold them accountable. If they refuse to participate, we'll have a one-on-one with them. We'll remind them that Skirich is evolving, and they either evolve with it or they're left behind." Marcus, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "And we need to reinforce that this is a company-wide change, not just a few new policies. People need to see the bigger picture. If we want to cultivate inclusivity, we have to live and breathe it in every aspect of our work." Ayanna smiled, a glimmer of resolve in her eyes. "Exactly. We need to be the change we want to see." The training day arrived with a heavy sense of anticipation. Employees shuffled into the conference room, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Ayanna knew that the next few hours would define the company's future. If she failed to make the case for the cultural shift, she could lose the support of those who were still on the fence. As the training began, Ayanna remained mostly in the background, observing the reactions of the employees. The trainers led the session with professionalism and sensitivity, presenting real-world examples of bias, discrimination, and the harm caused by unchecked prejudices. Ayanna had made sure to hire facilitators who understood the delicate nature of the conversation, and their approach was calm, respectful, but direct. But even with the best facilitators, not everyone was open to the experience. A few employees remained visibly disinterested, their arms crossed, their faces set in stubborn defiance. It was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of resentment that lingered in the air. Ayanna could feel it, but she refused to let it deter her. This wasn't about immediate results. This was about planting long-term seeds that would eventually bear fruit. When the training session concluded, Ayanna stood before the employees, her voice clear and unwavering. "I know today wasn't easy for some of you," she began. "But this is just the beginning. We are a company that believes in growth, and growth doesn't come without discomfort. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you, the changes we're making are necessary, not just for Skirich's future, but for the future of every person who works here." She paused for a moment, looking around the room at the employees whose faces remained unchanged. "I'm asking for your patience, your open-mindedness, and your commitment to building something better. We all have a role to play in shaping the culture of this company. And if you're not willing to play your part, then maybe Skirich is not the right place for you." Ayanna knew the weight of her words. This wasn't an ultimatum, at least, not in the traditional sense. But it was a clear signal that the company's culture would no longer tolerate complacency or ignorance. If employees wanted to stay, they had to be willing to adapt. They had to be willing to grow. The room was silent as she finished her speech, the employees processing her words in their own way. Ayanna had no idea how many of them would truly embrace the change, but she knew that she had done everything in her power to create a company that would stand for something greater than just profit margins and quarterly earnings. A few weeks later, Ayana began to see small shifts in the atmosphere of the office. The initial resistance hadn't completely vanished, but there were signs that the message was starting to sink in. More employees were participating in open forums about diversity and inclusion. Conversations that once seemed awkward or uncomfortable were becoming more common. Slowly but surely, the company was evolving. Ayana's resolve only strengthened with each passing day. She knew that the road ahead would be long, and the challenges were far from over. But for the first time since she had taken over as CEO, she felt that Stewardess was on the right track. This wasn't just about transforming a company. It was about creating a legacy of equity, inclusivity, and resilience that would outlast her own tenure. This was the beginning of something much bigger than her. As Ayana continued to spearhead the transformation at Stewardess, the challenges didn't subside, they evolved. With the cultural sensitivity training behind her, the real work was just beginning. The company's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and accountability had taken root, but it needed consistent care and constant reinforcement. Ayana knew the initial momentum would wane if they didn't build on it. The next phase would require leadership at every level of the organization, not just the executive suite. Despite the progress, the company still had its share of vocal detractors. A few employees continued to express their discomfort with the changes, sometimes in subtle ways and other times in more direct forms of resistance. Ayana had anticipated this, but it was still disheartening to see individuals who seemed to reject the very values the company was trying to uphold. For her, this wasn't about their opinions, it was about creating an environment where every employee, regardless of their background, could thrive. Ayana called a meeting with her senior leadership team to address the situation. "We can't afford to lose focus now," she said firmly. "We've made it clear what the expectations are, but we're seeing that some people are not embracing them. We need to reinforce our commitment and ensure that our actions match our words." Jennifer, who had been instrumental in the training rollout, spoke up. "I think we need to create more opportunities for dialogue, perhaps town halls or smaller discussion groups. Some people are resistant because they don't understand why the changes are necessary. It's about helping them see the bigger picture." Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We can't assume that everyone will get on board immediately. We need to make sure they understand that this isn't about punishing anyone, it's about growing as a company and as people." There was a brief pause before Marcus added, "We should also consider adding accountability measures. It's one thing to talk about values, but we need to demonstrate how we're living them. If someone's not aligning with the company's vision, they need to know there are consequences." Ayana smiled, impressed by the team's insight. "Exactly. This is about maintaining consistency and holding everyone, myself included, accountable for living up to the values we've established. We can't afford to let complacency creep in." As the meeting adjourned, Ayana felt a renewed sense of urgency. She knew that as a leader, her actions would speak louder than her words. It was up to her to set the tone for the entire company. She immediately began putting plans in motion to implement more opportunities for dialogue, ensuring that employees at all levels had the chance to engage with the company's vision. In the weeks that followed, Ayana held several town hall meetings where she addressed the company's progress, answered questions, and invited employees to share their thoughts. The responses were mixed. While some employees had embraced the changes, others still harbored doubts. Some openly questioned the necessity of the ongoing efforts, arguing that the company should focus more on performance and profits rather than social causes. Ayana responded to these concerns with patience and empathy, explaining that diversity and inclusion were not distractions, they were foundational to the company's future success. Through these interactions, Ayana noticed a subtle shift in tone. While resistance remained, it began to feel less like a battle and more like a conversation. People were beginning to open up, to ask difficult questions, and to engage in discussions that they had previously avoided. There was still work to be done, but Ayana could sense that the tide was beginning to turn. But not everyone was satisfied with the company's progress. One afternoon, Iona received a call from a reporter at a major news outlet. The reporter was investigating a story about Skirich's internal culture and had uncovered allegations of racial discrimination that had allegedly occurred several years ago. The reporter asked Iona for comment. For a moment, Iona was taken aback. The allegations had never been brought to her attention before, and she had no idea how much truth there was to them. She was disappointed, but she knew that this was a test. How would she respond? Would she downplay the situation or face it head-on? "I'm aware of the concerns you're referring to," Iona said, her voice calm but firm. "We take all claims of discrimination seriously, and we are committed to addressing any issues that arise. I can't speak to the specific allegations without further investigation, but what I can tell you is that the culture at Skirich is changing. We are holding ourselves accountable, and we will continue to work toward a more inclusive environment for all our employees." The reporter pressed for more details, asking about the company's response to the allegations. Iona took a deep breath, knowing that this could potentially make or break her efforts. "Our approach is about transparency," she said. "If there's wrongdoing, we will address it. This company is committed to growth, and that includes learning from past mistakes and doing the hard work to ensure that it never happens again." After the call, Iona sat in her office for a while, reflecting on the conversation. The story would likely gain traction, and she knew it could bring unwanted attention to the company. But rather than shy away from the issue, Iona saw it as an opportunity. If she handled it correctly, it could show that Skirich was serious about its commitment to change. Iona immediately called a meeting with her leadership team to discuss how to handle the situation. "This is going to be tough," she said. "But we have to be open about the fact that Skirich hasn't always been perfect. We need to own our mistakes, but we also need to show how far we've come and how committed we are to continuing this work." Jennifer spoke first. "We should have a public statement ready that acknowledges the allegations and outlines the steps we're taking to investigate them. It's important to show that we're not just responding to the media, we're genuinely concerned about any employee who's been affected." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We should also set up a confidential channel for employees to report any other issues they may be facing. That way, we can show that we're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk." Iona felt a surge of pride for her team. Their response was measured, thoughtful, and proactive. It was exactly what she had hoped for. "Let's move quickly on this," she said. "We have to act fast, but we also have to be careful not to overpromise. We can't solve everything overnight, but we can show our commitment to fixing it." The following day, Iona released a public statement acknowledging the allegations and outlining the steps Skirich was taking to investigate and address any past wrongdoings. She also announced a new initiative to improve transparency and accountability within the company. The statement received a mixed response. Some praised Iona for her honesty and leadership, while others questioned whether the company's efforts were enough. Iona knew this was only the beginning. Skirich had a long road ahead, and every day would require her to lead with conviction and integrity. But she also knew that each step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. As the weeks passed, Iona continued to lead Skirich through this difficult period with